The entire Old Testament tells the story of the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the people chosen by God and entrusted with His covenant promises. But according to the Bible, what does it actually mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be one of God's covenant people? Paul answers that question in Romans 2 verse 29. He is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. Throughout Romans 1 and the beginning of Romans 2, Paul establishes the universal problem of humanity, the revelation of God's wrath against sin. He begins with the Gentile nations. Although they knew God through His creation, they rejected Him, exchanged His glory for idols, and gave themselves over to all kinds of unrighteousness. The verdict is clear. Every nation stands condemned before a holy God. Then, Paul turns his attention to the Jewish people. In Romans 2 verse 17-29, the blessed apostle confronts the Jew and shows that they too stand under God's judgment. Paul begins by describing the incredible privileges God had given to Israel. You rest in the law. You boast in God because He has revealed Himself to your nation. You know His will. You approve what is excellent because you are instructed by the law. You are confident that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher of the Gentiles, possessing in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. And these privileges were real blessings. God had revealed Himself to Israel in a way that He had not revealed Himself to the surrounding nations. He had given them His commandments, His covenant, His promises, and His true and proper worship. But Paul is employing a masterful rhetorical strategy. The Jew looked at the pagan world and rightly recognized its sin, because he judged it by the law God had given him. They looked at the idolatry, immorality, and rebellion of the nations and agreed with God's judgment upon them. Yet Paul asks a devastating question. You teach others. Basically, you have the law. Do you teach yourself? Do you follow the law? You preach against stealing. Do you steal? You say that one must not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You who condemn idolatry, do you dishonor God? The issue is not whether the law is good. The law is holy, righteous, and good, given by God. The issue is whether those who possess the law actually obey it. And the answer is painfully clear. Throughout the Old Testament, Israel had often failed to keep the covenant. The prophets repeatedly testified that God's name was being blasphemed among the nations because of the disobedience of His own people. Paul's point is simple but devastating. Possessing God's law does not exempt anyone from God's judgment. The Jew who sins against God's commandments stands condemned just as surely as the Gentile who sins without them. That brings Paul to one of the most important arguments in the entire book of Romans. Gentiles do not need to become Jews in order to be saved. Why? Because the true purpose of circumcision was never merely external. Circumcision was given as the sign of God's covenant with His people. It marked Israel as belonging to God. But the outward sign was always meant to point to an inward reality, a heart devoted to God in faith and obedience. So Paul asks, is circumcision profitable? Absolutely. There is great advantage in being entrusted with God's covenant, God's promises, and God's law. But that advantage only benefits those who keep the covenant. If a circumcised person breaks God's law, his circumcision becomes as though it were uncircumcision. The outward sign cannot save him from judgment. On the other hand, if a Gentile who is physically uncircumcised fulfills the righteous requirements of the law, would he not be regarded as circumcised? Indeed, Paul says that such a Gentile would stand as a witness against the Jew who possesses the written law and circumcision, but nevertheless breaks God's commandments. This brings us to Paul's conclusion. If physical circumcision does not ultimately make someone a true Jew, And if merely being a descendant of Abraham does not guarantee membership among God's covenant people, then what does? Paul's answer is revolutionary. A true Jew is one inwardly. True circumcision is not merely performed on the body, it is performed upon the heart. It is the work of the Holy Spirit, not merely adherence to the written letter. The person whom God recognizes as his own is the one whose heart has been transformed by God himself. The praise that matters is not the praise that comes from men because of outward religious identity. It is the praise that comes from God because he has changed the heart. And this prepares us for everything that follows in Romans. Paul has placed the Gentile nations under God's judgment. He has placed the Jew under God's judgment. He has stripped away every excuse, every privilege, and every claim to self-righteousness. Because before God, all stand guilty. But the good news is, as Paul will go on to explain, that the same gospel is then offered to all. If no one can be justified by his own righteousness, then anyone can be justified through the righteousness of Jesus Christ. The purpose of Romans is not merely to show us our sin, it is to drive us to Jesus Christ. For when every mouth is stopped and the whole world becomes guilty before God, the gospel shines forth all the more brightly. That sinners may be righteous, not because of what they have done, but because of what Christ has done for them. God bless.